There is a letter. It was found in 2018, sealed inside a metal box, buried beneath the foundation of what used to be a courthouse in Georgetown County, South Carolina. The building was being demolished to make way for a parking structure when construction workers struck something that should not have been there. The box was small, rusted through in places, but intact enough to preserve what was inside. 3 pages of handwriting, brown with age, the ink faded to the color of dried blood. The letter was dated April 1833. It was written by a circuit court magistrate named Cornelius Ashford, addressed to no one, as if he knew it would never be sent. In it, he described a trial he had presided over, a case involving an enslaved man accused of something the letter never names directly, but Ashford's fear is obvious in every line. He wrote, "I have sentenced men to hang and felt nothing. I have ordered the whip and seen flesh laid open to the bone without losing sleep. But this Negro looked at me from the witness stand as though he were the judge and I the accused. He did not speak out of turn. He answered only what was asked, yet every word he spoke made me feel as though I were being weighed, measured, and found lacking." Ashford's letter continues for 2 more pages, but the handwriting deteriorates. By the 3rd page, the script is barely legible, the sentences incomplete. He mentions something about a record kept in the mind, about testimony that cannot be burned, about the terrifying realization that enslaved people might be watching, remembering, documenting everything. The letter ends abruptly. If what he claims is true, then we have been building our own indictment, and there is no fire hot enough to destroy it. The man Ashford was writing about was named Jabari Mensah, and what you are about to hear is the story of what he did, how he did it, and why it was buried so deeply that even now, speaking his name feels like unearthing something forbidden. This is not a story about rebellion in the way history usually tells it. There were no midnight escapes, no armed uprisings, no dramatic rescues. What Jabari Mensah did was quieter, slower, and far more dangerous to the system that enslaved him. He refused to forget, and he taught others how to do the same. By the time he died in 1867, there were over 300 people across 4 states who carried his teachings in their minds, an archive of names, dates, genealogies, testimonies, and atrocities that no fire could burn, no law could suppress, no violence could erase. This story has been deliberately excluded from history, not because the evidence didn't exist, but because acknowledging it would require confronting a truth that powerful institutions spent generations trying to bury, that enslaved people were not passive victims, but conscious witnesses, that memory itself could be weaponized, and that the most dangerous form of resistance was not the kind that announced itself, but the kind that worked in silence, across decades, preserving testimony until the moment it could finally be spoken aloud. What follows is that testimony, reconstructed from fragments, court documents, letters, oral histories recorded decades after emancipation, and the few written accounts that survived deliberate destruction. It is a story America tried to erase, and the fact that you are hearing it now means the erasure failed. Jabari Mensah was born in 1789 in a region that is now part of Senegal, in a village whose name does not appear on any European map from that period. His family were not royalty, but they were not laborers either. They occupied a middle position in Wolof society. His grandfather had been a griot, a keeper of oral history, and his father was a merchant who traded in textiles and grain. This was not a life of luxury, but it was a life with structure, education, and dignity. Jabari was taught to read the stars, to calculate trade values, to memorize the genealogies of his family going back 7 generations. He learned 3 languages before he was 12. He was being trained to inherit his father's trade and to eventually become a griot himself if he showed the aptitude for it. He showed the aptitude. By the time he was 15, he could recite the complete lineage of his family, the history of the Wolof kingdoms, and the trade routes that connected the interior villages to the coastal ports. His memory was not exceptional by the standards of his training. Griots were expected to hold far more in their minds, but it was disciplined, structured, and reliable. This training, which seemed like a preparation for an ordinary life, would become the foundation of something far more dangerous. In 1807, when Jabari was 17, French traders working with a local warlord raided his village during the dry season. This was not random violence. It was a commercial transaction. The warlord had agreed to provide 50 young men, ages 15 to 25, in exchange for guns, iron, and rum. The selection was precise. They did not take the sick, the very young, or the elderly. They took the ones who would fetch the highest price: strong, intelligent, educated enough to be useful, isolated enough to be expendable. Jabari was taken to a stone fortress on the coast, a structure built by Portuguese traders specifically for processing human cargo. He spent 11 weeks there, chained in a large room with 80 others, waiting for a ship. During that time, he observed everything: the routines of the guards, the faces of the other captives, the layout of the fortress, the rhythm of the tides. He did this not because he believed he would escape, but because his grandfather had taught him that a mind left idle begins to decay. So he exercised his memory the way an athlete exercises muscle, keeping it functional even as his body weakened from hunger and confinement. It was during this period that he met a man who would change the course of his resistance. The man was older, perhaps 50, and had been a senior griot before being captured and sold by a rival political faction. His name was Amadou, and he understood something that Jabari, at 17, had not yet fully grasped. This was not just theft of bodies. This was an attempt to erase entire cultures, languages, histories, civilizations' worth of accumulated knowledge. Amadou spoke to Jabari during the few moments when the guards were not watching. He spoke quietly, without emotion, the way a teacher delivers a lesson that must be learned precisely. "They will try to take your name. They will try to take your language. They will beat you until you believe you are what they call you. But if you can keep your memory intact, you carry something they cannot destroy." Amadou did not speak of hope or eventual freedom. He was too practical for that. He was teaching survival technique, the preservation of identity through deliberate memory work. He explained that the way a griot memorizes thousands of lines of oral history was the same way Jabari would need to memorize everything about himself that the slave system would try to erase. His family's lineage, the geography of his homeland, the stories his grandfather had told him, the taste of foods he had eaten, the sound of his mother's voice, the way sunlight looked at dawn over the river. Amadou died 6 days before the ship arrived. The official cause listed in the trader's ledger was fever, but the other captives understood it differently. He had simply stopped fighting to survive, his body surrendering even though his mind remained clear until the end. Before he died, he made Jabari promise something. "Remember everything. Not just your own story, but mine. My name is Amadou Traoré, son of Ibrahim Traoré, griot of the Wolof court under Damel Amari Ngone Ndela. I was born in the year the great drought ended." And he recited his complete lineage, going back 7 generations. Jabari memorized every word. When the ship, La Marie Victoire, a French slaver operating under Portuguese registry to avoid British patrols, departed the coast in June 1807, Jabari was chained in the cargo hold with 293 other captives. The voyage lasted 14 weeks. Of the 293 who boarded, 138 survived. The rest were thrown overboard, their bodies feeding the sharks that had learned to follow these ships across the Atlantic like scavengers following a caravan. The Middle Passage was everything the historical accounts describe: systematic brutality designed to transport the maximum number of living bodies at the minimum cost. Jabari's movement was so restricted that his muscles began to atrophy. The air was thick with the smell of human waste, sweat, and death. The sounds, people losing their minds, people dying, people praying in languages the sailors did not understand, created a constant, suffocating noise. But Jabari had Amadou's teaching. During those 14 weeks, while his body weakened nearly to the point of death, his mind engaged in an act of deliberate preservation. He recited everything he had memorized: his own lineage, Amadou's lineage, the stories his grandfather had taught him, the geography of his homeland. When he finished those, he began memorizing new things: the faces of people chained near him, the patterns of the ship's daily routines, the specific phrases the crew used. This was not optimism, it was technique. The ship reached Charleston in October 1807, 1 month after the act prohibiting importation of slaves officially banned the transatlantic trade to the United States. But the law had not yet been enforced, and ships that arrived before January 1808 were still legally processed. Jabari was sold at an auction on Chalmers Street to a rice planter named Marcus Henley for $690, a price slightly above average for a young male classified as prime field hand. The plantation Henley operated was located 30 miles inland, near the Combahee River, where rice cultivation required extensive labor in conditions that killed enslaved people at rates higher than almost any other form of agriculture in the South. The work involved standing in flooded fields for 12 to 14 hours a day during planting and harvest seasons, exposed to malaria-carrying mosquitoes, venomous snakes, and infections from cuts that never fully healed in the stagnant water. The plantation's overseer, a man named Silas Kern, managed the labor force with calculated brutality. He kept detailed logs, records that somehow survived and are now housed in the South Carolina Historical Society, documenting daily output, punishments administered, and mortality rates. His entries are clinical, detached, unsettling in their precision. One entry from November 1807 reads, "New Negro from Charleston, assigned number 47, shows adequate strength but disturbing intelligence. Maintains eye contact during instruction. Recommend close observation." That Negro was Jabari. And what disturbed Kern was not disobedience. Jabari performed every task assigned to him, but something in his demeanor that suggested he was studying the system, learning its mechanics, identifying its weaknesses. Enslaved people were supposed to show brokenness, at least in the presence of white authority. Jabari showed none. During his first year on Henley's plantation, Jabari did not resist in any visible way. He worked. He learned English by listening carefully to the overseers and the American-born enslaved people who spoke it fluently. He observed the social hierarchies among the enslaved population, noting who held influence, who could be trusted, who was isolated. And at night, in the slave quarters, he began teaching. He spoke in Wolof to the few other African-born captives who understood the language, explaining what Amadou had taught him. That they would try to take everything: name, language, identity, But memory was territory they could not fully occupy. He asked each person to tell him their real name, where they were born, what they remembered about their families, and he memorized everything they told him. Within 6 months, there were 12 people on Henley's plantation engaged in this practice. They would work during the day, performing the brutal labor required, and at night they would recite their histories to each other, creating a collective archive that existed only in their minds. The plantation owners had no idea this was happening. They saw obedient slaves. They did not see the resistance being built in a language they did not understand, through a practice they did not recognize as dangerous. But then Jabari began teaching the children. The plantation had approximately 20 children under the age of 12, most of them born there to mothers who had been brought from Africa or sold from other states. These children spoke English, practiced Christianity, and had no direct memory of Africa. From the white perspective, second-generation slaves were ideal, fully shaped by the plantation system, with no alternative cultural framework. Jabari saw these children as the real battlefield. If African memory could be transmitted to American-born children, the system's ability to erase identity across generations would fail. The teaching happened in fragments, never in ways that overseers would recognize as education. Jabari would work beside a child in the fields and say, as if speaking to himself, "In my homeland, we had a different word for this." And he would describe something, a plant, a tool, a method of navigation, in careful detail, making it sound like idle conversation. Or he would tell stories in the evening, framing them as entertainment, tales of warriors, kingdoms, migrations. To white observers, if they noticed at all, it looked like an old African telling harmless folk tales. To the children, it was evidence of a world beyond the plantation, proof that their ancestors had been something other than slaves. Within 3 years, approximately 18 children on Henley's plantation could recite basic West African oral histories. They knew fragments of Wolof, Mandinka, Fula, and, most dangerously, they understood that their enslaved status was not a natural condition, but a crime committed against them by people who had no moral authority to claim their labor. This was what truly terrified plantation owners when they eventually discovered it. The system relied on enslaved people internalizing their supposed inferiority, believing on some level that their bondage was divinely ordained. Education that taught otherwise was more dangerous than any weapon because it undermined the psychological foundation that made slavery possible with relatively minimal force. In 1811, Silas Kern began to notice something shifting. The slaves were still obedient, still productive, but there was a quality to their compliance that felt different, less defeated, more like strategic cooperation than acceptance. He could not articulate it clearly, but it made him uneasy. Then he overheard 2 children speaking in a language that was not English. When questioned, the children claimed ignorance, said they were just repeating sounds they had heard from their mothers. But Kern was not fooled. He reported his suspicions to Marcus Henley, who initially dismissed them as paranoia. But Kern insisted, and Henley eventually ordered increased surveillance of Jabari specifically. For 6 months, Kern watched Jabari constantly. He assigned him to isolated work details to separate him from other slaves. He moved his sleeping quarters. He implemented rules prohibiting conversation during work hours. None of it mattered. The teaching had already taken root. 18 people had learned what Jabari taught, and they continued teaching each other even when he could not directly participate. The network had become self-sustaining. This was Jabari's genius. He had not created a system dependent on his personal leadership. He had taught a method that others could practice independently. Every person who learned his memory techniques became a teacher. The plantation could kill Jabari, and the resistance would continue. In 1813, Marcus Henley sold Jabari to a slave trader named Vincent Shaw. The sale was not punishment for any specific offense. Henley simply wanted him gone. He had become convinced, without being able to prove it, that Jabari's presence was contaminating the other slaves, making them less manageable. Better to sell at a loss than risk whatever influence he was exerting. Shaw operated a coffle, a mobile prison that marched enslaved people overland from the Carolina coast to markets in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. The journey typically took 2 months and killed roughly 10% of the human cargo through exhaustion, disease, or injury. Jabari was chained in a line with 39 others and marched west. During this journey, he did something extraordinary. He systematically learned the story of every person in that coffle, their names, origins, families, memories. He created a mental archive of 39 identities that the system intended to erase. And during the brief rest periods when Shaw allowed minimal conversation, he taught them his memory preservation techniques. Most of these people would die within a decade, their bodies worked to death on cotton plantations, their graves unmarked. But for 2 months, they had someone who listened to their stories and remembered. The coffle reached Montgomery, Alabama in March 1814. Shaw sold most of his inventory at auction, but Jabari and 6 others were transported an additional 120 miles to a cotton plantation owned by a man named Samuel Blackwell. Blackwell's operation was vast, nearly 4,000 acres worked by over 250 enslaved people. The scale was staggering. This was not farming. It was industrial processing of human beings into cotton. The overseer, a man named Jacob Mercer, ran the plantation with systematic violence that made previous overseers seem restrained by comparison. Mercer believed maximum productivity came from keeping slaves in constant fear, just below the threshold of rebellion. He maintained meticulous records of each person's output, punished anyone who failed to meet quotas, and conducted random beatings to ensure even high performers never felt safe. His journals, which somehow survived and are now kept at Emory University, document calculated cruelty with the precision of scientific experimentation. Jabari's arrival coincided with an incident that would establish his reputation among the enslaved community. During his second week, a young woman collapsed in the fields from heat exhaustion. Mercer's response was to have her dragged aside and beaten for malingering. Jabari, working nearby, said something no African-born slave was expected to say to a white overseer. "She needs water and shade. She will die otherwise." Mercer turned with an expression of genuine shock. New slaves, especially African-born ones with limited English, did not offer medical assessments to white men. "What did you say, boy?" Jabari repeated himself, this time in clearer English. "The woman needs water and shade. What you call heat exhaustion will kill her within the hour if untreated. I have seen this before." The other slaves expected Mercer to beat him unconscious. Instead, something stranger happened. Mercer, despite his brutality, recognized expertise when he heard it. And he understood that replacing dead slaves cost money. "You know medicine?" Jabari did not formally, but his grandfather had taught him about heat-related illnesses common in West Africa. "I know what is happening to her body. Give her water, shade, and rest, or your master loses property." The economic argument convinced Mercer. He ordered water brought and had the woman moved to shade. She survived. And that evening, Jabari had established something crucial: specialized knowledge that had commercial value. Slaves with useful skills received marginally better treatment because their expertise could not be easily replaced. Over the following months, Jabari carefully cultivated a reputation as someone who understood health and could distinguish between genuine illness and malingering. He could not save everyone. The work regime was designed to destroy people regardless of medical intervention. But he saved enough lives that Blackwell and Mercer began consulting him regularly, pulling him out of fieldwork to examine sick slaves and recommend treatment. This role gave Jabari something invaluable: access to nearly every enslaved person on the plantation and time to speak with them privately. The conversations happened during medical consultations. While examining someone for fever or treating an infected wound, he would speak quietly. "What is your name? Your real name, not what they call you. Where were you born? Do you remember your mother's name?" And he memorized everything they told him. But he did more than collect information. He taught the same memory preservation techniques he had developed years earlier. The stories you remember, teach them to your children. The names of your ancestors, speak them aloud when you are alone so you do not forget. They are trying to erase who we were. Do not let them succeed. By 1819, Jabari had created another network involving at least 60 people. They met in small groups during Sunday rest periods, ostensibly for Christian worship, but actually conducting what amounted to classes in African history and language. The cover was perfect. Plantation owners encouraged slave Christianity, believing it promoted docility. They never considered that religious gatherings might be used to preserve the very cultural knowledge Christianity was supposed to replace. Samuel Blackwell was more observant than Marcus Henley had been. By 1820, he noticed something troubling. Older African-born slaves seemed to be teaching something to younger American-born slaves. He could not identify what was being taught, but he observed children using African words, enslaved people showing signs of something other than complete psychological defeat. Not rebellion exactly, but pride. The absence of the total brokenness that efficient management required. Blackwell did not connect this directly to Jabari. Tracking influence patterns among 250 people was nearly impossible, but he recognized something needed to change. In 1821, he implemented new rules. No gatherings of more than 5 slaves outside supervised work. No private conversations during Sunday services. Random inspections of quarters to ensure nothing forbidden was being kept or taught. These measures slowed Jabari's work, but did not stop it. The network adapted. They met in smaller groups, taught more carefully, developed coded language that sounded like Christian theology to white listeners. The kingdom of our fathers meant West African empires. The crossing meant the Middle Passage. The time before captivity meant pre-slavery African life. White overseers heard what they expected, slaves discussing scripture, while actual history was being preserved beneath their notice. Then, in 1824, something happened that would set in motion events leading to Jabari's most dangerous act of resistance. A Methodist circuit preacher named Reverend Thomas Whitfield began conducting missionary work among enslaved populations. Whitfield genuinely believed slavery was divinely ordained, but also believed enslaved people had souls requiring Christian salvation. So he traveled from plantation to plantation, teaching Bible verses and conducting literacy classes for any slaves their owners permitted to attend. Samuel Blackwell, himself a devout Methodist, allowed 20 slaves to participate, including Jabari. This decision would prove catastrophically wrong. Jabari learned to read with the focus of someone who understood the skill's revolutionary potential. The plantation system deliberately kept enslaved people illiterate because literacy enabled forgery of travel passes, access to abolitionist literature, and the ability to educate oneself about the world beyond the plantation. A literate slave was a slave who could potentially organize others far more effectively. Reverend Whitfield never considered that teaching reading might have consequences beyond religious education. He assumed enslaved people who could read would naturally accept biblical passages that seemed to justify slavery, the ones about servants obeying masters, about accepting earthly suffering for heavenly reward. He never anticipated they might also notice Exodus, the prophets condemning injustice, Jesus' statements about freedom for captives. By 1826, Jabari could read fluently. More importantly, he could teach reading to others covertly. Within 3 years, approximately 40 enslaved people on Blackwell's plantation were literate, a number that would have horrified any white person who knew about it. And then Jabari did something that would eventually be investigated by 2 courts and become the subject of legislation across the South. He started writing things down. Not on paper, which would be discovered and destroyed. He wrote on surfaces white people never examined. The interior walls of storage buildings using charcoal that could be wiped away if inspectors came. The undersides of floorboards, the backs of wooden beams. And most remarkably, he taught other literate slaves to do the same. What they wrote was documentation. Names, genealogies, memories of Africa, dates of beatings, names of people sold and separated from families, accounts of sexual violence committed by white overseers. This was not just cultural preservation. This was evidence, testimony that could potentially be used against plantation owners if slavery ever ended or if abolitionists gained access to these records. In August 1831, Nat Turner led a rebellion in Virginia that killed approximately 60 white people before being suppressed with overwhelming violence. The rebellion sent shockwaves through white communities across the South because it demonstrated that enslaved people could organize, plan, and execute coordinated action despite surveillance systems designed to prevent exactly that. The response was predictable. Harsher laws, increased surveillance, systematic campaigns to eliminate any education or organizing among enslaved populations. One new law prohibited teaching slaves to read or write under any circumstances. Reverend Whitfield's literacy classes were banned. Any enslaved person found with written materials faced severe punishment. Plantation owners began conducting thorough searches of slave quarters. During one such search in early 1832, an overseer at Blackwell's plantation found writing on the interior wall of a grain storage building. It was in English, which meant someone literate had written it, and the content was devastating. A list of names, dates, and descriptions of punishments inflicted over several years. Evidence of systematic violence documented by people who had been told they were property incapable of sophisticated thought. The investigation that followed was extensive and brutal. Every enslaved person on the plantation was questioned, several under torture, about who had written the documentation. Multiple people died during interrogations without revealing anything useful. White authorities were convinced this had to be the work of an outside agitator, possibly an abolitionist who had infiltrated the plantation, because they could not conceive that enslaved people might organize something this sophisticated independently. But Samuel Blackwell had a suspicion. He remembered the African who demonstrated medical knowledge, who learned to read with unusual speed, who somehow seemed central to social networks among the enslaved population. He ordered Jabari brought to the main house for questioning. What happened during that interrogation was documented in court records from subsequent legal proceedings. Blackwell, Jacob Mercer, and 2 other white witnesses spent 4 hours trying to extract a confession from Jabari. They used every technique available: beatings, threats, psychological pressure. Jabari's response was consistent throughout. When Blackwell demanded to know who had written the forbidden documentation, Jabari looked at him with direct eye contact, the same unbroken gaze that had disturbed overseers for decades, and said something the court records preserved verbatim, because everyone present found it deeply unsettling. "I wrote nothing, but I remember everything. Every name of every person you have brutalized, every date of every beating, every child torn from their mother and sold, every woman violated by your overseers, Every man worked to death in your fields. I carry all of it here." He pointed to his head. "You can destroy paper. You can burn books. But you cannot burn memory. And memory is a weapon you will never take from us." The room went silent. What disturbed Blackwell and the others was not defiance. They had dealt with defiant slaves before. What disturbed them was the implication. If Jabari had actually memorized years of detailed records, dates, names, specific incidents, then he possessed something far more dangerous than written documentation. He was a living archive that could not be destroyed without killing him, and even then, he had clearly taught his methods to others. Jacob Mercer later wrote in his personal journal, "The Negro speaks with clarity, suggesting genuine recall rather than fabrication. If what he claims is true, if he and others like him have systematically memorized records of plantation operations, we face a threat unlike any rebellion. These are witnesses who will testify against us if abolition ever comes. They are building a case in their minds that will condemn us." Blackwell's response was immediate. Sell Jabari. Not as punishment, but as removal of a problem too complex to solve through violence. If Jabari was teaching memory techniques, killing him would not stop the spread, but removing him might contain the damage. In 1832, Jabari was sold to a trader named Richard Cross and transported back to South Carolina. He was now 43 years old, considered elderly for an enslaved field worker. Most men who survived to that age had accumulated enough injuries and health problems that their value decreased significantly. But Jabari's medical knowledge and his reputation for intelligence, disturbing as it was, meant he still commanded reasonable prices from buyers seeking skilled slaves. The plantation he ended up on was owned by George Pritchard, located 15 miles outside Georgetown. Pritchard operated a smaller property than Blackwell's, only about 70 enslaved people working mixed crops. But Pritchard had a particular interest in what he called Negro psychology. He believed efficient plantations were not those with the most brutal overseers, but those that understood slave mentality and manipulated it scientifically. When Pritchard purchased Jabari, he had been explicitly told this slave had been sold for being too intelligent and potentially corrupting other Negroes with seditious ideas. Most buyers would have avoided such a purchase. Pritchard was fascinated. He wanted to understand what made certain slaves mentally resistant to the psychological breaking slavery required. So he brought Jabari to his plantation not primarily for labor, but as a kind of study subject. The dynamic that developed between Pritchard and Jabari was genuinely bizarre. Pritchard would have Jabari brought to the main house several times weekly for conversations where he asked questions about African culture, slave psychology, resistance techniques. Pritchard framed these as academic inquiry. He was writing what he hoped would be a comprehensive manual on plantation management based on scientific understanding of Negro behavior. Jabari recognized these conversations as opportunity. He began teaching Pritchard deliberately false information mixed with enough truth to seem credible. He explained that African-born slaves were naturally incapable of complex planning, that they responded best to consistent routine and moderate discipline, that second-generation slaves, properly Christianized, showed no interest in African culture. All calculated to make Pritchard believe the threat of slave intelligence and organization was overblown, that proper management could eliminate any risk. Meanwhile, Jabari conducted his actual work among the enslaved community on Pritchard's plantation. Within 8 months, he had established the same network he had built elsewhere: systematic teaching of memory preservation, African cultural education, creation of living archives. But he added something new, something he had been developing since his interrogation at Blackwell's plantation. He began teaching people how to weaponize their memories. The technique was sophisticated, drawing on practices his grandfather had taught about griot training. A properly trained griot could recite information using rhythm, repetition, emotional resonance, making stories not just memorable, but psychologically impactful. Jabari adapted this for a specific purpose, teaching enslaved people to remember trauma so completely, so vividly, that they could describe it in ways that would psychologically devastate white listeners. This was not just about factual accuracy, though that mattered. This was about emotional truth, teaching people to access and articulate their suffering in language so powerful that no white person could dismiss or rationalize it. The goal was to create witnesses who could testify not just to what happened, but to what it felt like, in descriptions that forced listeners to confront the full human cost of slavery. By 1843, Jabari had trained 14 people in these techniques. They practiced together, rehearsing how to describe their experiences in ways that would haunt anyone who heard them. On an October night in 1844, 14 people met in the woods 3 miles from Pritchard's plantation. They were not conducting a ritual, despite what white authorities would later claim. They were practicing testimony, rehearsing how to describe their experiences of slavery in vivid, emotionally devastating detail. 2 white men stumbled upon the gathering. Brothers named Daniel and William Crawford. They had been hunting and heard voices speaking in what initially sounded like an African language. Curious, they approached quietly. What they witnessed was Jabari leading what appeared to be some kind of ceremony where each person stood and recited their life story with disturbing precision and emotional force. Court records from the subsequent investigation include Daniel Crawford's testimony describing what he heard. The Negroes spoke about their enslavement with detail that seemed unnatural. One woman described being separated from her children, the specific sounds they made crying, the feeling of her breasts still full of milk days after they took her babies, the nightmares she still had, that I found myself physically ill listening. Another man described the middle passage in language so vivid I could smell the ship's hold, hear chains rattling, feel the terror. It was as if they were forcing their suffering directly into my mind. What disturbed the Crawford brothers most was not the content itself, troubling as that was. It was the effect. After listening for perhaps 15 minutes before revealing their presence, both men reported experiencing vivid, intrusive thoughts about the experiences they had heard described. Daniel Crawford testified that for weeks afterward, he would suddenly find himself experiencing fragments of memories that were not his, sensations of being chained in darkness, emotional states of grief over lost children, phantom pain from beatings he had never received. William Crawford's experience was more severe. According to multiple witnesses, he began speaking in languages he had never learned, describing places he had never seen, experiencing what doctors diagnosed as Negro delusions, believing himself to be an enslaved African rather than a free white man. His condition deteriorated until he required institutionalization. The white community's response was immediate panic. If enslaved people had developed some psychological technique that could affect white people's minds, that could transmit trauma through mere description, then the foundation of slavery was threatened. The system depended on white people being able to inflict and witness suffering without experiencing empathy or psychological consequences. If that barrier could be broken, if slaves could make their owners feel what slavery actually meant, the moral sustainability of the institution would collapse. Two separate investigations were launched. The first was a county inquiry to determine whether Jabari and the others had used African witchcraft or poison to affect the Crawford brothers. This investigation included testimony from multiple witnesses, but ultimately concluded no physical substances or supernatural forces were involved. The second investigation was conducted by the South Carolina Medical Society, which examined William Crawford and tried to understand his condition. Their report, which still exists in the Society's archives, is remarkable for its candor. The patient exhibits symptoms consistent with having experienced traumatic events he could not have personally lived through. He describes enslavement with specificity of direct experience, despite being born free. We can identify no medical explanation for this transfer of memory or trauma. The only hypothesis accounting for observed symptoms is that extended exposure to detailed descriptions of suffering can create psychological impressions that mimic actual experience. A special committee of the state legislature convened to assess whether new laws were needed to prevent whatever Jabari had done. The committee heard testimony from plantation owners throughout the region, consulted ministers and doctors, and produced a report recommending sweeping changes to how enslaved people were managed. The report's key finding was buried mid-document, but devastating in its implications. We conclude that the teaching of memory techniques to slaves, combined with their systematic documentation of plantation operations and their development of methods for vividly describing experiences, represents a threat to public order, requiring immediate legislative action. Legislation followed, passed in South Carolina in 1845 and adopted in modified form by several other southern states. It prohibited teaching enslaved people any memory techniques or mnemonic systems. It made gatherings of more than 3 slaves without white supervision illegal. It required plantation owners to rotate slave populations regularly to prevent formation of long-term communities where knowledge could be preserved across generations. And, most tellingly, it mandated separation or sale of any enslaved person identified as possessing unusual intelligence or capability for organized resistance. George Pritchard, whose plantation had been the site of the 1844 incident, faced social pressure from other plantation owners who viewed him as dangerously naive. The expectation was that he would make an example of Jabari, public execution, or, at minimum, punishments severe enough to terrify anyone considering similar resistance. But Pritchard refused. His reasoning, preserved in a letter to his cousin, revealed something about how certain white people understood the threat Jabari represented. If we kill him, we make him a martyr and confirm his methods are powerful enough to frighten us. If we torture him publicly, we prove psychological resistance warrants the same violent response as physical rebellion, validating his approach. The most effective response is containment, while publicly dismissing his influence as overblown hysteria. So, instead of execution, Pritchard sold Jabari to a man named Edmund Hale, who ran a small plantation in the interior with only 18 enslaved people. The expectation was that Jabari would be isolated, where his influence would be minimal, where Hale, warned about Jabari's history, would keep him under strict surveillance. This was 1845. Jabari was 56 years old. He had been enslaved for 38 years, survived multiple plantations, witnessed countless brutalities, lost contact with everyone he had taught in previous locations, endured decades of systematic attempts to break his will. Any reasonable person would have been psychologically destroyed. But Jabari was not ordinary. Edmund Hale's plantation was different from the industrial operations Jabari had experienced. With only 18 enslaved people, everyone knew each other intimately. There was no anonymity, no way to conduct secret meetings without Hale becoming aware. Hale lived on the property in a house overlooking the quarters and personally supervised most work. For someone trying to organize resistance, this surveillance state should have been impossible to work within. Jabari's solution was brilliant in its simplicity. He stopped trying to organize anything that looked like resistance from an external perspective. Instead, he focused entirely on teaching a single practice that could be done individually, silently, in ways no surveillance could detect. How to meditate on memories in ways that preserved identity while processing trauma. This practice drew on techniques his grandfather had taught, adapted through nearly 4 decades of experience with slavery's psychological impact. The core principle was that memories of trauma needed to be acknowledged and preserved rather than suppressed, but held in ways that did not destroy the person carrying them. You had to remember the middle passage without letting that memory prevent experiencing joy. You had to preserve knowledge of family members sold away without being paralyzed by grief. You had to maintain awareness of systematic injustice without succumbing to hopelessness. The technique involved what Jabari called witnessing, a practice where you would sit quietly, typically late at night when no one was watching, and deliberately recall specific traumatic memories while maintaining emotional distance. You would describe the memory to yourself in detail, acknowledging what happened and how it felt, but framing yourself as an observer documenting events rather than a victim being destroyed by them. This created psychological space between core identity and experienced trauma, preventing trauma from completely defining who you were. The 18 enslaved people on Hale's plantation learned this practice over several years. It required no group meetings, no suspicious gatherings. Jabari would simply work alongside someone and speak quietly about the technique. The practice spread because it worked. Edmund Hale noticed changes in his enslaved population that troubled him. They were not rebellious or defiant in obvious ways. They worked adequately, followed instructions, but there was something about their psychological state that felt wrong. They seemed less broken than slaves should be. They maintained dignity that properly managed slaves were not supposed to have. In 1847, Hale wrote a letter to his brother, the letter discovered in 2018, sealed in that metal box beneath the courthouse. The fear he expressed was not about physical rebellion. Jabari was in his 50s and did not seem to be plotting escape or violence. The fear was about something more fundamental. Hale had begun to suspect this particular African possessed knowledge about psychological resistance that made conventional slavery impossible. That the very presence of someone who could teach others to preserve their minds despite enslavement represented an existential threat to the system. "I cannot explain it clearly," Hale wrote, "but this Negro looks at me with eyes that have seen things I cannot imagine and remembers things I would prefer forgotten. He makes me feel that I am the one being judged, that history will view my actions differently than I view them myself. Worse, he has taught this same awareness to the others. They are slaves in body, but free in mind, and I do not know how to break something I cannot physically touch." The letter ended with a confession, revealing more about slavery's psychological cost to white people than most historical documents ever acknowledged. "I dream about the things they have experienced. I wake convinced I am chained in darkness, that I am being beaten, that my children are being sold. I think he has cursed me somehow, but the curse is simply forcing me to imagine what slavery means to those who endure it. I cannot continue this way." Hale never sent the letter, and he never sold Jabari, because within months of writing it, something had shifted in him that made continuing plantation operations impossible. In 1848, Hale freed all 18 enslaved people, sold his property, and moved to Pennsylvania, where he became an abolitionist. Jabari Mensah was freed in 1848 at age 59. He was one of approximately 23,000 free black people living in South Carolina at that time, navigating a society that viewed their existence as dangerous and their freedom as provisional. Free black people in the antebellum South faced constant surveillance, restrictions on travel and assembly, and the ever-present threat of being kidnapped and sold back into slavery if they could not prove their status. But Jabari had something most free black people lacked: decades of practice organizing and teaching under surveillance, a vast network of knowledge existing in the minds of hundreds of people he had taught across multiple plantations, and a skill set for psychological resistance he could now share more openly. The final 19 years of Jabari's life, from 1848 until his death in 1867, are documented in fragments historians have pieced together. He lived in Georgetown, working as what would now be called a community organizer and educator. He taught literacy to free black children and adults. He conducted what he called remembering circles, where people shared experiences of slavery and practiced the witnessing techniques he had developed. And he served as a living library. Anyone wanting to know about African culture, family history, or the realities of slavery that white historians were already sanitizing could come to Jabari and learn. More importantly, he trained others to continue his work. By the time of his death, months after the Civil War ended slavery throughout the United States, Jabari had created a network of approximately 280 people across 4 states who practiced his memory preservation techniques and taught them to others. These people became the foundation for what would evolve into the oral history tradition that kept African American experiences alive despite systematic attempts to erase them from official records. Jabari Mensah died on March 22, 1867, in a small house in Georgetown, surrounded by people he had taught. The cause of death was recorded as pneumonia, but several witnesses said he had simply decided it was time to stop. The funeral was attended by nearly 200 people, a gathering large enough that local authorities considered breaking it up as a potential security threat. Free black assemblies of that size were technically illegal, but the local sheriff made a calculated decision not to intervene. The war had ended. Slavery was abolished. Creating martyrs seemed counterproductive. So the funeral proceeded, and what happened during that gathering would be remembered in black communities throughout the South for the next century. 19 different people stood and recited portions of what Jabari had taught them. Not speeches or eulogies in the traditional sense. They recited genealogies, complete family histories of enslaved people that Jabari had memorized and preserved. Names going back generations, origins in specific African regions, cultural practices maintained despite slavery's attempts to erase them. Each recitation took 10 to 15 minutes. Collectively, they represented something unprecedented. A public demonstration that enslaved people's histories had not been lost. That the cultural genocide slavery intended had failed. That witnesses existed who would testify to what had been stolen. A woman named Charlotte stood and recited the names of 53 people who had been sold from various plantations between 1828 and 1846. She spoke each name clearly, gave dates, described where they had been taken if known, listed family members they had been separated from. When she finished, she said simply, "Jabari taught me to remember these people so they would not disappear from history. They were here. They existed. We bear witness." One after another, people demonstrated what Jabari had created. A systematic archive of slavery's realities, preserved in human memory, and now being transferred to written records that could survive permanently. This was documentation, evidence presented publicly for the first time because the people carrying it finally felt safe enough to speak. Within 2 weeks of Jabari's funeral, a coordinated campaign began to suppress discussion of what had happened. Local newspapers were asked to print corrections. Ministers were instructed not to discuss the incident. Plantation records throughout the region began to be systematically destroyed. Ledgers documenting punishments, sales, operational details were burned or lost in ways suggesting deliberate elimination of evidence. This suppression extended beyond South Carolina. In Alabama and Georgia, fires destroyed record-keeping buildings. Free black people known to practice Jabari's techniques were arrested on fabricated charges and forcibly relocated. The goal was erasing evidence that enslaved people had been conscious witnesses throughout bondage, had preserved testimony that could be used against the entire system. But you cannot erase something existing in hundreds of minds scattered across multiple states. You can burn documents, silence witnesses, but you cannot destroy knowledge distributed through a network designed to survive suppression. The memory preservation network Jabari created continued after his death. During Reconstruction, witnesses from South Carolina, Alabama, and Georgia provided testimony that was remarkably detailed and consistent, evidence they had been trained by someone who understood memory could be weaponized. Jabari's story was deliberately excluded from historical narratives for over a century. Court records were archived but never referenced. Edmund Hale's letter remained hidden for 171 years. This erasure was successful because acknowledging it would require admitting everything mainstream history claimed about slavery was incomplete or actively deceptive. The rediscovery began in the 1960s, when historians started investigating African American oral traditions as legitimate sources. In 2018, when construction workers found Edmund Hale's letter, suddenly there was physical evidence corroborating everything oral histories had maintained. Jabari's story proved enslaved people were conscious witnesses who preserved detailed testimony. It proved psychological resistance was more sophisticated than physical rebellion. Most dangerous of all, it proved memory itself could be weaponized, that witnessing was resistance no violence could fully suppress. This is why the story you are hearing was buried for nearly 2 centuries, not because evidence did not exist, but because acknowledging it would require confronting truths American culture has spent centuries avoiding. Jabari Mensah's legacy is that he created a methodology for resistance that transcended his individual life, that functioned across generations, that proved memory could be weaponized in ways violence never fully defeated. Every person he taught became a living archive. Every technique he shared became a tool others could use. His influence appears in how civil rights activists documented brutality, in contemporary movements preserving oral histories of systemic racism. Every time someone refuses to forget, because forgetting means letting perpetrators escape accountability, they use memory as the weapon Jabari said it could be. Edmund Hale's letter ended with these words: "I fear this man more than any living thing, because he has shown me that I am the one who will be forgotten, while he and what he taught will be remembered." Jabari spent most of his life enslaved. He suffered trauma that should never have been inflicted. But what he created represents something significant: evidence surviving to testify, proof consciousness cannot be fully destroyed, demonstration that the most dangerous resistance is not always the most visible. This is the story America tried to erase. The truth buried in walls and archived reports and oral traditions mainstream historians ignored for 171 years. The fact you heard it means the erasure failed. Now you carry that knowledge forward. You are one more witness to what was suppressed and what survived. That is how memory defeats forgetting, through networks of people who refuse to stop remembering and teaching what they know. This is the forbidden story that America tried to erase forever. And the fact you heard it means the erasure failed.